meeting. I know we used to do this in the old days, and I think this is really important for us as a national office to do. National Chief has been meeting regularly with First Nation leadership across the country. She's also been meeting a lot with a number of federal ministers over the last few months to discuss priorities going forward. But also, I just want to note that NC has been recognized for her work lately. In the Toronto Star's Vaccine Heroes of 2021, she was one of the 20 people who took on the biggest job of the pandemic and helped Ontario get its shots. It was published in December. And most recently and currently on the newsstands, National Chief was voted to the Maclean's Power List, the 50 Canadians who are forging paths, leading the debate, and shaping how we think and live. It's actually the current issue that's on the stands right now. So I just wanted to give you that because I know that's not something that a lot of people know about. But to keep up on the events and announcements in our office, please follow National Chief on our social media through Twitter and Facebook. And I just want to go quickly through our agenda. I'm doing the introduction right now. We're looking for like one question and a follow-up for each journalist. And if there's more time, we'll do a round two. And maybe we can start by just doing a raised hand system. If you want to ask a question, I will go to you for that. But for now, National Chief RoseAnne Archibald.
RoseAnne Archibald, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. First, I always want to acknowledge the Creator, the world around us, and our place within it. Today, I'm coming to you from the traditional and unceded, unsurrendered territory of Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish nations. And I want to acknowledge all of you on the territories where you are today. Thank you to my special advisor, Donna Simon, for opening us up in a good way. And I do want to welcome you to my office's first Indigenous Media press conference. As you know, to be in leadership in a time like this is extraordinarily challenging. We are emerging from a global pandemic. We are still in the midst of it with this Omicron. We've been navigating wildfires, flooding. We've had other extreme weather influenced by climate change. We had a federal election, a state of emergency in response to political unrest recently. But above all, we've been collectively grieving the little ones who did not return home from the institutions of assimilation and genocide. And I really want to commend you, all of you, on your dedication and work during these unprecedented times, working to get out information and stories that matter to First Nations people. As National Chief for the AFN, it's my honor to advocate on behalf of our people during this important time in history. I do so every day with what I call a strength-based and heart-centered approach, embodying leadership that's grounded in love and care, as well as holding space for respect in all my interactions. I really want our future generations to look back at this time and see how it was a turning point in history, or as I like to say, herstory. And I'm really hopeful, I'm hopeful about the future. I'm eager to put in the hard work. We have been really working hard during this first part of my term. And I'm also motivated by the momentum that First Nation leaders have built together these past 7 months. Throughout our collective grief and hardships, there comes this hope and an opportunity for fundamental change. And so in the months ahead, I'd like to start and maintain this open dialogue with you, the Indigenous media particularly. Within my office, we'll soon be circulating a newsletter every quarter. We'll be uploading audio and visual addresses more regularly. And as many of you know, prior to the federal election, my office launched a First Nations priorities document, which we called the Healing Path Forward. And those priorities really offered a strategic direction toward positive and evolutionary change for First Nations and all Canadians. And you, of course, can view that document on the AFN website, where we talk about those 5 priorities. But part of the Healing Path Forward rests with you as media. You play an important role in how our stories are told. And that's why I want to be connected to you more regularly through these kinds of press conferences, because I want to encourage the culturally appropriate and respectful manner that you have been sharing news with our citizens. You are forthright, you can deliver unbiased and hard-hitting news, while at the same time recognizing how these stories impact First Nations in terms of their mental health and well-being. And I don't think that the non-Indigenous media contemplates that when they formulate their news priorities. The next steps for all of us, including Indigenous media, is to take a trauma-informed approach to news and storytelling. We've witnessed many instances in the last year of survivors and intergenerational trauma survivors being triggered into old hurts. And I believe that the media can be a part of not only bringing these hard stories to light, but illuminating what I call the healing path forward, so that our people can continue to survive and learn to thrive despite past and ongoing colonization. So I thank you for being here, and I'm looking forward to taking any questions that you have.
What?
Okay, so let's open it up to anybody have a hand up? We have Brett from APTN.
Hey everybody, can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Good to see you all. National Chief, my question is a fairly timely one. Do you have any indication as to whether the Federal Emergencies Act, which was just invoked, will apply or be used on First Nations people or activists who may be engaged in, protest activity?
I did get a call from Minister Mark Miller ahead of them invoking the Emergency Measures Act. And we did talk about the purpose of it, which was to deal with the situation in Ottawa around the Freedom Convoy. There are definitely some long-term implications to invoking this act. In the immediate term, there are some, as we know, Indigenous people that are involved in the Freedom Convoy, and they certainly will be impacted in the same way that non-Indigenous protesters will be impacted. I am really concerned, though, about the long-term future of protests and civil actions that First Nations might take, and when is a situation going to be deemed an emergency, and will the government, now that it's utilized this act for non-Indigenous people, quickly act when our people are involved in civil actions or protests in the future? It's something that is on my mind and I'm very concerned about.
Thank you for that answer. That was going to kind of lead into my follow-up there. Some critics say that the invocation of this act here kind of lowers the bar on what constitutes an emergency and perhaps sets a dangerous precedent for the future. Could you elaborate a little bit on how concerned you are and what your concerns are there?
Well, let's look back to the actions in Tyendinaga in 2020 when the railroad action was happening. Now, we all know that was not a blockade. That was a potential to disrupt the rail service, but there was no actual blockage of the railway at that time, but it was impacting the delivery of goods by rail at that time. And so when that kind of action happens again, will the government quickly, enact the Emergency Measures Act and put people into, what we're seeing right now in Ottawa, people going to court, people being put in jail, bank accounts frozen. I mean, these things they have a long-term impact. And that's my concern, is that, First Nations have valid concerns in this country around lands and water, particularly land rights. And if they're defending their land rights, where does the government draw the line? I think that, hopefully we can get into situations where we're in positive negotiations around any actions. Whereas what I think happened in Ottawa is just a real sense of mayhem and, the people going there to overthrow the government in a way which to me is not something that First Nations would call on so much as asking for action on particular political issues. Thank you, Brett.
Thanks, Brett. Anybody have their hand up right now? I'm looking.
Hi, Jamie. It's
Sure.
Sharon Ryan.
Oh, Sharon?
Sharon Ryan with Windspeaker. I can't figure out how to put up my hand.
Okay. Yeah, Sharon, please. Go
Okay.
ahead.
So National Chief, first of all, congratulations for the McLean's shout out. That's awesome. When you had your conversation with Mark Miller before the enactment of the act, did you express your concerns to him, and what did he say to you?
Yeah, I did express my concerns about the long-term implications. And at that time, we didn't have a lot of time to discuss the long-term impacts, more about what would be happening on the ground in Ottawa and why they felt they needed to enact that particular piece of legislation. So there are going to be more discussions in terms of the long-term impact of the Emergency Measures Act on First Nations in the future. And in fact, it's something that I will likely be discussing with my staff in terms of either writing a letter to the Prime Minister and ministers about our concerns around that. That could be one of the actions that we'll be taking. And certainly, further media releases or statements might be forthcoming as well.
Thank you. And a follow-up. When the graves were uncovered last week near Kamsack, you said you'd like to see the Canadian flag lowered every time graves are uncovered. Mr. Miller's office says the government is committed to raising the NCTR survivors flag indefinitely at Parliament Hill. Now, I'm not clear if indefinitely means permanently, but is that good enough for you?
No. I believe that, these are 51 children that we recovered, 215, in Kamloops, over 700 in Cowessess, and many more to come. And every time that we do these recoveries, we need to see some kind of solemn gesture from this government. And it is something that I did request. It hasn't been met, but I'll continue to press for some kind of solemn gesture to recognize every time we do find our children in these unmarked graves. Thank you. Thank you, Sherry.
Thank you, Sherry. I believe Rick Garrett had his hand up next. Rick?
Yeah, I was going to try to find out if the National Chief has any comments on what Nan has spoken about on the lifting of COVID restrictions in Ontario. I was wondering if she wants to speak about concern she has about that. Like myself, my own cousins in Constance Lake currently have COVID. My nephew there he's working on the Watay power line. He's got possibly has COVID, and my brother had COVID in the Kenora extended care facility recently. So I was wondering if she wants to speak a bit about concerns from First Nation communities about the COVID situation in their communities, even though all these restrictions are getting lowered.
Yeah, at the beginning of the pandemic in Ontario, I was regional chief at the time, and very early on, I recommended that First Nations actually lock down their communities sometime in March 2020. And the government at the time didn't have very strong measures. I don't think that they had locked down before we did. Or it was around the same time. As my memory's kind of a bit foggy on it. But essentially, I was recommending stronger measures for First Nations, given that we have so many underlying conditions and social determinants of health and living conditions. And some communities don't have proper drinking water. And so I've always been an advocate of erring on the side of caution when it comes to measures for First Nations in order to protect our most vulnerable people, especially our elders and our knowledge keepers. And so despite Ontario lifting restrictions, I believe that each First Nation has to determine for itself what they will do in terms of their own restrictions and how they will slowly open up. It really depends on vaccination rates. If you have a community that has a very high vaccination rate, then COVID can come in there and be certainly less harmful. And we've seen that in many cases where vaccinated people have less symptoms or they have milder symptoms, I should say, and they're not ending up in hospital. So I think having vaccines puts us in a different place than we were at the beginning of the pandemic. At the same time, I believe we still need to be a little more cautious than the rest of society and determine our own opening up plans. Thank you, Rick.
I think I'm okay for now, but I have another question for later.
Okay, Rick, thank you. And Victoria Gray, Turtle Island News, all yours.
Hi, good afternoon. I was just wondering if, with the recent events in Ottawa and a lot of the racism being expressed, does it concern you that a good bit of Canadians are backing what seems to be this white nationalist regime?
Sorry, you cut out a little bit on my end there, Victoria. I just heard, I missed part of the question about Canadians.
Does it concern you that it seems like a lot of Canadians are backing what is a white nationalist regime? Well,
the leaders of this freedom convoy definitely have been involved in white nationalist movements in the past, and they haven't highlighted that. And I believe that most of the Canadians that are supporting this movement, so to speak, are more concerned about measures for COVID. They're concerned about mandates and lifting mandates more than they are about supporting white nationalist agendas. And I know that if they came out with a real strong white nationalist agenda and had that kind of messaging, they would lose a lot of support. But they do have the support just because people are frustrated with the pandemic and frustrated with having to live in the manner that we're living, where we have to be cautious, we have to wear masks, we have to physically distance. People just generally are losing patience with the pandemic itself. And so at the same time, I am concerned about white nationalists having this kind of platform. And what I have seen is that they've reached back to some of their old messaging but they've been keeping their current messaging focused on freedom and the mandates. And but I don't believe the majority of Canadians support them because I think there is a vocal portion of the society that supports what's going on. And when I did a statement on the situation in Ottawa, I called upon our allies to speak up, to say something against what was going wrong in terms of this freedom convoy, and to speak up against hate and to speak up against racism. And so many people did answer that call. It wasn't, I'm sure I'm not the only, they weren't answering my call specifically, but there were many counter protests, other actions to support, everyday people out there, non-Indigenous people who support healthcare workers, who want to be safe, who care about their neighbors, who are willing to follow the health measures until we're fully out of the pandemic. So it's a little bit of a convoluted situation with white nationalists getting involved for sure. And I think it's very troubling. But I've always said that, in Canada, First Nations are subject to overt, covert, and systemic racism on a daily basis. And this is something that we have to do something about in this country. We have to ensure that our society is healthier and that First Nations people are treated with dignity and respect and have equity and equality always. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you, Victoria. And we have a hand up with Dan Jones from the Mississippi Broadcasting Corporation. Welcome, Dan.
Welcome, Drinhozo, National Chief. We've seen some conservative politicians and even premiers quick to denounce the Indigenous protesters, say in BC or even in Ontario on the rail lines, but we're very slow to do the same for the blockade in Ottawa, to the point where some premiers appeared to be in support of the protest movement, kind of maybe scoring political points. Can you just speak to what you see as the hypocrisy of the positions of these politicians and how you go about advocating or navigating for equal treatment?
The first part of your question is about premiers who support this movement. And this is what I've always said about this system, this colonial system. It's not ours. It's been put upon us. It's been brought to this country. It's been brought to Turtle Island. It is like a blanket that covers our inherent and natural, our inherent rights and our natural laws, our God-given rights as First Nation people. So this system belongs to non-Indigenous people. It's not our system. And so when non-Native politicians look at their own citizens, their own non-Indigenous citizens in a state of protest against their very own laws and regulations and policies that those governments are enacting, they have to respond to that because that's their electorate. So does it surprise me that some premiers and non-Indigenous politicians have come out in support of these non-Indigenous protesters? No, it doesn't surprise me because it's their own system. And the second part of your question about racism, and I said this earlier about the overt, covert, and systemic racism that is faced by our people, is absolutely wrong, given that this is our land. This was the land that the Creator gave us. He placed us on different parts of Turtle Island as different nations. And that, to me, needs to be respected as we move forward. non-Indigenous people have to understand that every good thing that they have in this country, every freedom that they have, their wealth, their prosperity, their ability to build a home on land is the result of First Nations treaties that exist, or, in the sense of modern or pre-Confederation treaties, also based upon the graciousness of the host nations. Like there aren't treaties, for example, here in BC, but there's a graciousness and a love and care from First Nations people who understand that many people have come to Turtle Island, to make a better life for themselves. And I think that's where we've got to go in terms of educating the public about who we really are as First Nations people in this country, and how we do need to be respected and treated with dignity, and how racism is a mental health condition. I think I saw a video that is actually a mental health condition, that people have mental health issues when they think that they need to treat somebody else differently based upon the color of their skin or their religion or their beliefs. So I think we've got a long ways to go in terms of correcting the situation of racism in this country, but we have to keep pushing forward. We have to keep calling it out. We have to create, legislation and policies around it for this government to make sure that we're safe in our own country. Miigwech.
Yes, just a follow up. Yesterday, the FSIN and the federal government announced the creation, first in Saskatchewan, of a First Nations Health Ombudsperson's Office to investigate claims of discrimination in Indigenous people accessing health services. So I want to get your initial thoughts on that, and whether the AFN is advocating for more of these offices in other provinces and territories in the country.
The idea of an ombudsman, specifically for health in Saskatchewan, I think is a good idea. There is a process in Quebec where they are, looking at Joyce's principle, a process there around systemic racism in the healthcare system. BC has also done some work with Mary Ellen Trappel-Lafond around systemic racism in the health system. So each region will have their own kind of response and their own solutions that they want to put forward. And I'm going to support all the regions on this issue of how they roll out processes and solutions to begin to combat that within the health system. I'm just going to grab a glass of water. I'm just going to turn off my camera for a second.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much. Ashish.
Thank you, Rich. Is there anybody else that wants to go next when NC gets back?
Okay, I'm back.
I don't see any hands right now.
Hey, Jamie, I could ask a question. It's David Moses.
Sure, David, please.
Thanks for doing this. Nice to see you, National Chief. Speaking of correcting the situation, I'm just wondering, there's the delegation that's going to be heading off to Rome coming up later on in March. I'm just wondering, from that delegation and from that trip, what are you looking for in terms of maybe a message or an answer that's going to come back from that trip in light of what you were saying, and also in light of the Pope's anticipated visit coming to Turtle Island and First Nation territory to potentially make an apology?
One of the key messages, and this is the lead for the AFN, is Regional Chief Jerry Antoine. And one of his key messages is to have the Pope revoke the doctrine of discovery, the 1493 papal bull, the Inter Cetera. And that's one of the key things that is driving systemic overt and covert racism, is the belief that when that doctrine was enacted or made, that paper bull was declared, it essentially said that First Nations people needed to be subjugated, and that our cultures and our religions and our way of life was not valid. And so if you look at some historical documents, that's one of them that needs to be revoked and replaced with something that actually acknowledges that First Nations people are valuable, that our cultures are vibrant and can contribute and have contributed to health and well-being, not only of our nations, but of the planet as a whole. And so that's one key message. The other purpose of having this delegation attend is to have that interaction with the Holy Father on seeking, being able to not petition him, but bring some comments and ideas to him around when and how he could apologize to First Nations people. It's long overdue. And so that's the second key message around his apology. And I think, was there another part of that question? I felt like it was about what messages are we taking to the Vatican?
Yeah, thank you for that. But as a follow-up, I'll just ask this in light of what we've been seeing and hearing and the findings ongoing of residential schools and the unmarked graves and children. And because the trip to the Vatican had been postponed once. I'm just wondering if you're getting a sense from the Pope or the Vatican about the possibility of that apology becoming a reality.
We're not getting any indication on that. We are getting an indication, obviously, that the Pope will be coming to Turtle Island. That is definitely been a commitment and an invitation by the Catholic bishops. And as far as I know, he has accepted that and now is just trying to find the time that he will come to Canada. And so in terms of his visit, there's a lot to sort out there around, where does he apologize? And certainly he owes us an apology. The church owes First Nations people an apology for the atrocities that they committed against us. I mean, the horrifying stories that we've all heard were perpetrated by nuns and priests within the Catholic Church. So they undoubtedly owe us an apology. And how that happens, we're not clear on yet.
Right.
Thank you, David.
Jimmy Gretsch, Noah.
Thanks, David. Anybody else have anything that didn't ask a question yet?
Rick's hand is up.
Rick. Go ahead, Rick. I know you had a
Hey, I had another question. This is on something different. Matawa just put out a press release. They're calling on Canada to establish a Matawa Canada Northern Development Table for economic prosperity that benefits all Canadians, including First Nations, in budget 2022. Do you want to comment on that or anything that AFN is planning to do similar for budget 22?
Well, first of all, I want to support any kind of regional initiative that is driven by First Nations. So if Matawas begins its own process, I think that that's great work that they will do. The Ring of Fire is going to be one of the biggest developments in the history of Ontario. And so having them lead discussions around prosperity and building their economies is really important. The AFN has made budget submissions, and we've talked about also with this government major investments into economic development in all areas, really. But one area that we have been advocating for is a national prosperity table, similar to the Ontario Prosperity Table that I began when I was the regional chief in Ontario. So it'd be a national table to look at national funding for First Nations and to also look at ways of rebuilding economies in First Nations, it's important to note that economies did exist prior to contact, and those were decimated by colonialism, and it's incumbent upon governments to help rebuild those economies that they destroyed. Thank you, Rick.
Thanks, Rick. I just saw that press release. It just came out 15 minutes ago. Is there anybody else? Marcy, I know you're here. If there's anything you would like to ask over at Anishinaabe Nation.
Hey, Jamie. No,
Hi.
I am listening along and I'm taking notes. Interesting comment, though, about treaties, which made me think of my favorite time of year, Treaties Recognition Week in Ontario. It's like my Christmas. Is there anything, I know it's Ontario specific, but I'm wondering if you see someday we having a week across Canada to really truly recognize treaties, and there's those education pieces that go along with it, both public and in schools. Do you see anything like that coming in the future?
That's a possibility, although it's important to note that not every piece of land in Canada is covered by treaties. There are many nations that have no treaties. And so, but I think that the idea of a national treaty day, I think, is a good one for sure. But how do you recognize and deal with the many nations in Quebec and BC who don't have any treaties at all? But I do want to raise my hands to Anishinaabe Nation for the work that they have done on Treaty Week, and how that came out of your area and then went right across Ontario. Thank you, Marcy.
Thanks, Marcy.
You got.
Okay, it looks like we should be wrapping up here. If there's any last questions, anyone?
So Sharon Ryan again, still can't figure out how to raise my hand, but I don't think David could figure it out either, so I'm not alone on that. So National Chief, in Alberta, there's been a situation here where the chiefs have voted November 30th to remove Marlene Poitras as regional chief for Alberta, and they declared the position vacant since July 1st, 2021, when her term ended. However, the AFN website still has her listed as regional chief for Alberta. What's going on with this?
The website is under construction. We've been complaining about the website as well in my office. Just so you know, it's not totally up to date. She is not recognized at the AFN table as being the regional chief any longer, though.
So has a date been set for an election for a new regional chief?
We have had a preliminary meeting with the Alberta chiefs, and that they would be getting back to us in terms of the next election.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria.
That was Sherry.
Oh, sorry, Sherry. So it looks like we're wrapping up here, folks. Just wanted to thank everybody for coming out. We will have more of these in the future. And maybe we can close it off with some words, National Chief.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie, and thank you to our comm staff in the National Chief's office, as well as the comm staff at the AFN Secretariat for making this happen. And I also want to thank all of you out there in the media for the great work that you continue to do. And I look forward to these regular sessions again, so that we can have more time to talk about our specific issues around Turtle Island, Miigwech. So I guess we'll turn it over to Donna. Jamie?
Sure.
Okay.
Miigwech Janado. Thank you, Creator, for bringing us together today. We thank you for the breath we have in our bodies and our hearts. I want to say thank you for the ability to communicate want to say thank you for the ability to hear one another and listen and ask questions. I want to say thank you. Thank you today for all of our lives, for all of the gifts that you've given us. Keep us safe and keep our families safe as we go about our work and our days. Thank you for all of the journalists across the world who are doing a great job trying to bring the news to the people. Keep them safe and their families safe in this very much sacred work that they do. Miigwech Kajamado, thank you.
Miigwech.
English, everyone.